executions are no fun, unless you happen to be in the audience. For most of history, public executions were seen as a legitimate form of entertainment. Large crowds would come from all over, and the wealthy would pay good money for front row seats. Executioners would even sell souvenirs, like the rope used in a hanging, or the body parts of executed criminals. But this commercialism is actually one of the less disturbing aspects in the history of execution, unlike the gut-wrenching methods of murder themselves. Punishment has always been especially harsh for sailors, a necessary evil to prevent mutiny, and the most feared punishment of all at sea was keelhauling. It involved a line of rope being looped around the ship, then you'd be attached to it and thrown overboard. As those above pull on the rope, your body will be dragged along the underside of a ship. If you're lucky, it will only be done once or twice, and you can hope to recover from any broken bones. But if it's an execution, they will just keep dragging you back and forth until you die. The most painful part here is not the water, but being dragged against the ship, including the rock-hard barnacles. Keelhauling was likely a rare punishment because historical records seldom mention it. But if you're a 1600 sailor and you see those ropes come out, it was not your lucky day. One of the more visually impressive execution methods is impalement. Famously used in psychological warfare by Vlad the Impaler, thousands of his enemies suffered it. And when foreign armies invaded his land, they were greeted by a forest of human corpses. Despite the invaders having overwhelming numbers, they were so scared by the forest of impaled corpses that they just gave up and went home. And if you're having trouble visualizing this, it is said to have involved 20,000 corpses, so we really can't blame them for just running away. But the history of impalement goes back much further, and there are numerous methods of doing it. In ancient times, victims were usually impaled through the stomach or chest. Vlad's favourite method though was to have the pole inserted from the anus to the shoulder, as to prolong death for as long as possible. This next one will sound like something out of a Victorian horror story, and there's a good reason for that. Immurement is the term for being walled up alive. You'd be surprised how many people were executed in this way, from medieval knights to modern-day serial killers. Legends tell of unfaithful wives being walled up by their husbands. Edgar Allan Poe featured it in one of his most disturbing stories, and at one point it even happened to Thomas the Tank Engine. But it was a real and very brutal punishment. With no hope of escape, victims muffled screams are their final sign of life, fading out a few days after immurement begins. Execution by wild animals was a common practice in the ancient world. In the Roman Colosseum, criminals were condemned to be killed by a wide range of predators: leopards, lions, wolves, crocodiles, bears, and more. It was a penalty withheld for specific crimes, like kidnapping children or employing sorcerers to harm others. Meanwhile, in much of Asia, people were being killed by elephants. Typically, they were held down and had their head crushed by a big dumb elephant foot. Elephants have always been a symbol of power, so for execution they were used almost exclusively by royalty, and as a practice, execution by elephant only faded going into the 19th century. We've all heard the term hanged, drawn and quartered, but in reality it's a lot less relaxing than you might assume. First, the prisoner would be dragged through town behind a horse. Then they would be hanged. Not enough to kill them yet, but enough to cause extreme pain. Next came the worst stage, disembowelment. While still alive, their internal organs were pulled out and burned in front of them. If still somehow alive after the burning, they were beheaded. The body was cut into 4 pieces and publicly displayed. As you can imagine, it was only typically used in cases of high treason, to make an example of the offender, and the last time somebody was sentenced to it was in 1839. The brazen bull is one of the most ridiculous methods of murder of all time, and that is saying something. Built for the tyrant of an ancient Greek city-state, it was a large hollow bull, cast entirely from bronze. On its side was a small door, through which a victim was placed inside the brazen bull. The door was sealed, a fire lit underneath, and the victim roasted alive. Just that alone is horrifying, and the most cartoonishly evil part is yet to come. Special acoustic tubes were built within the bull, so that the painful screams of a victim would be kind of distorted into the roaring noise of a real bull. Smoke would also be emitted from holes in the bull's nose, making it a whimsical experience for anyone watching. In medieval times, the most feared punishment of all was to be broken by the wheel. It began with a large wooden wheel, the kind seen on wagons. In front of a jeering crowd, the criminal would be bound to it. When helplessly tied up, the executioner would begin to break their limbs, smashing them with a large hammer. The number of swings depended on the nature of the crime, but with every swing the crowd cheered. An experienced executioner could keep the victim alive for numerous days, and in some cases they were hanged by the wheel like a strange form of crucifixion. One unusual case saw a victim last 4 days and 4 nights. Flaying. Even the sound of that word feels harsh. There really isn't much to say about it. It's just unnecessarily cruel, which to be fair you could say about everything mentioned on this list. If you're not familiar, it involves removing a victim's skin, causing them to die from blood loss, hypothermia, or sheer shock. It was regularly carried out as a form of sacrifice by the Aztec to please a god known as Zippy Totec, the Flayed One. According to tradition, he would flay himself every year as a way of guaranteeing a good harvest for the Aztec, which I think is very kind of him. Creepy and weird, but very kind. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the Persian Empire had developed an ingenious and terrifying execution method. Because the empire was known for its tolerance, they needed an especially cruel penalty for treason. That penalty was to be tied to a small boat and smeared with a thick mixture of milk and honey. So far, it might not sound all that bad. I mean, it's weird, but not that bad. However, you would then be abandoned in the middle of a small lake. Under the hot sun, its sweet smell will soon attract all kinds of insects, and unable to move, the traitor is slowly eaten alive. And when I say slowly, the agony was said to last more than 2 weeks. Like all things I fear, the worst execution method is Chinese. It is known by many different names: Lingchi, lingering death, or simply death by 1,000 cuts. Different regions have different methods, but generally speaking, the criminal is bound to a pole or wooden frame. With an especially sharp blade, strips of flesh would then be cut away from their person. Depending on the crime, thousands of incisions could be made, primarily to the arms, legs and chest, and the length it took to kill was totally unpredictable. If able to, you might wish to bribe the executioner to make his early cuts deeper and more likely to kill. Given how brutal this is, you probably expect it to have been outlawed many centuries ago. But the last time it was carried out by the Chinese government was in 1905, and believe it or not, it was actually caught on video.